Okay. All right. Lesson 15, the harmony of the Gospels, the first cleansing of the temple. I will turn off my camera so that everybody can see the whole slide if that's a problem to have the camera on. So we're going to be looking at lesson number 15. And as we talked about at the very end of the last class, we did look at this passage in John, the 2nd chapter, in verse 12. After the wedding at Cana, after this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. So we have now kind of seen a week. The week after the wilderness testing of Jesus, the temptations of Jesus, all of these things have happened chronologically based off the scriptures. Day one, they're near the Jordan, and John testifies of Jesus, and on that day. On the second day, Jesus spends more time with Andrew and John, and he meets Peter on that day. The third day, near the Jordan, he spends time with Philip and Nathanael, and on days 4 and 5, he makes his way to Cana. Now, after that day, there's a wedding feast in Cana, and now he is back in Capernaum with his friends, his disciples, his family, and we know that Capernaum becomes a very important place for Jesus as we go further in our study. And so I want to take a look a little bit at Capernaum and just kind of learn a little bit more about it. I had the pleasure of visiting the city when I went to Israel in March, just a few months ago, with Barry Britnell, and it was fascinating to me. They believe that they certainly have identified the great synagogue that was built there by that centurion who loved the Jews and who the Jews loved. In Matthew, the 4th chapter, we see that we begin to see how important this city is to Jesus. In that text, in leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which was by the sea in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali. And then in Matthew 9, so he got in the boat, he crossed across, and he came to his own city. And at that point, Capernaum is called his own city. So after this wedding feast in Cana, like we said, his brethren, probably his brothers and sisters, the disciples, his mother, go there. Now we know that Peter had a home in Capernaum, which I mentioned, and Capernaum kind of became the headquarters for Jesus and his disciples. It was a fishing village. We believe that Peter lived there due to his fishing business that he and his brother Andrew were both part of. James and John also acquainted and probably lived in Capernaum, sons of Zebedee, who had a fishing business as well. We're not sure why Jesus's family followed him back from the wedding feast at Cana to Capernaum. It could be if James and John are cousins, which I believe that they were. They would have perhaps had family in this area. Maybe Salome, like I said, I think Zebedee lived here. There always seemed to be a boat available for Jesus in Capernaum, and they seem to follow him there. It seems that Jesus does relocate to Capernaum, perhaps to see more of the signs and wonders of Jesus. His family also ended up there. But we know that along with him now, at this point, there are still people that are accompanying him who will later turn against him, particularly his brothers. Now, it is interesting because they're beginning to see miracles, and we know that John indicates, and I believe John was probably with him, indicates that if he were to write all of the miracles that Jesus did, there would not be enough room for the world to contain the books which they were written in. And so we know that at this point, Jesus is probably beginning to do some signs and wonders on a regular basis. And so he notes here that Capernaum will become an important place We note here that Capernaum does become an important place. And like I said, it's the site of that wonderful synagogue that the centurion will build. We know that Matthew certainly is from this city. He was not called yet, so Matthew would not probably have been among those that were there with Jesus closely on these days. But for now, Jesus is only going to stay briefly here. We're not told how he spends his days. The miracle at Cana surely had been the beginning of something that would ramp up and become more pronounced. Particularly among this small group of these Galilean Jews. It also must be noted here that whatever he did during these days was quiet. It was unnoted in comparison to what was happening in what was about to happen in Jerusalem. Capernaum is beginning to hear. My guess is there's some stirring happening. The miracle at Canaan, and if there were others, began to probably be rumbles within Galilee. We know that Jesus will spend more time in Galilee than anywhere else in his ministry. And so we will begin to see how important these places play a role in the ministry of Christ. So in these early months, they're normally added to the 3 years of the ministry that are being calculated from Passover to Passover. We're about to head back down from Capernaum down into Jerusalem. Passover celebrated on the 15th of March and to the 15th of April, the month of Nisan. So we know that before Jesus goes down into Jerusalem for his first Passover that is noted in his ministry and in the gospel chronological records, other than, of course, when he was 12, the first immediately before that first Passover were his baptism, his temptation, that was 40 days, the wedding, and the signs and the words of the new disciples in Galilee, the signs and the words for the new disciples in Galilee. So if we are taking the time to really chronologically lay out Jesus's ministry, it was a little bit more than 3 years. So 3 years plus. We do know that it is Passover now. And we will begin our examination of an early Judean ministry that Jesus will accommodate early on, right after the very first Passover Passover in that first year of his ministry early on. The Passover's at hand. All the nation throngs to the capital city. At the age of 12, Jesus had startled the great scholars of the nation in his discussions with them in the temple, but now he comes in the fullness of divine authority and power, R.C. Foster will say in his studies of the life of Christ. And so a month before Passover, the bridges and the roads would begin to be prepared for the worshipers. They would be repaired, they would be mended, they would be fixed. The gravesides and the tombs would be whitewashed, remember, so that they would be very noticeable, that they would stand out, so that the travelers would not defile themselves by coming upon one of the tombs unaware. The pilgrims came from all over to prepare to see that they would see open stalls along the way in the towns that they would walk past and be in and travel through. And these open stalls would sometimes be permanent, but a lot of times would be temporary, just for this month prior, just to make ready the way to that temple, so that the Jews could pay. The stalls would be for money changing. They would sell animals for sacrifice, so that the Jews could be ready for all the mandatory temple needs. Temple tribute, which all of the Jewish men and proselyte men would pay. The women didn't, the slaves didn't, the minors didn't, but it had to be paid in a half a shekel, which was strictly an Israeli currency. It was not the Roman currency. Remember when Jesus looks for a demerits in the temple in order to prove, when they say, should we pay our taxes? And he finds a demerits. It's important for him to find a demerits. The shekel would have been the currency in the temple, but he finds that demerits because it's got that demerit because it's got the image of Jesus on it. And he proves the point that if it is a demerit, it would be due Caesar. But the temple tax was a half a shekel according to a sacred standard. And this was the tax that the priests were also exempt from unless they chose to pay it. So it was important for these Israelites, as they made their way into the city, to be able to get what they needed along the way. And so the money changers actually were not just in the temple, but outside the temple as well. It's important and mandatory to remember that it was mandatory for the Jews to pay that money and to change their own money. The priest who collected the temple tax did not give you change. So you had to have the exact amount. The temple tribute had to be paid to participate in Passover. And like I said, it had to be paid exactly a half a shekel. And it could not be paid, of course, in Persian or Tyrian or Syrian or Egyptian. Couldn't be paid with Greek coins or Roman money that circulated all throughout the country and was coming in from all of the places that the Jews lived with these travelers. And so everyone coming in, generally speaking, would have to make change. So money changers were extremely busy. And so as we read these from the 15th to the 25th of Adar, they had these stalls in every country, so a month out on latter date, which must therefore be considered as marking the first arrivals of the festive pilgrims in the city. The stalls in the country would be closed. So these money changers then would sit, some of them would move into the temple after the travelers had really pretty much made their way along the way. You can read Jewish history that sometimes the ones in the further cities, once the travelers, really the majority of the travelers got past them, would go ahead and make their way to the temple or near the temple, set up their booths more closely in line with Jerusalem itself. I want to read from Edersheim's book about the temple, Its Ministry and Services by Alfred Edersheim, tells us that it was tremendously important, these temple taxes that must be paid. The strict discipline, both in regards to the priests and the worshipers, would, however, been necessary, may be inferred even with the immense number of worshipers which thronged into Jerusalem and the temple. According to the late computation, the temple would have held within its colossal girdle 2 amphitheaters of size of the Colosseum, as the latter is reckoned to be capable, inclusive of the arena passages accommodating 109,000 persons. The calculation that the first temple must contain at one time about 210,000 persons seems to by no means exaggeration. It would readily be believed what immense wealth this multitude must have brought into this great national sanctuary. Indeed, the temple treasury had always been an object of cupidity to the foreigners, as was successfully plundered by the Syrians and the Romans. From biblical history, we know how liberal were the voluntary contributions at the time of Moses, of David, again at Joash. Such offerings of the temple treasury continued to last a very large source of revenue. They may be brought either in the forms of vows or free gifts. To this practice, Christ may have referred in denouncing the scribes and Pharisees to devour the widows' houses for the pretense and for a pretense make long prayers. For a good deal of this money went in the end from the temple treasury to them, although there is no evidence of them in treating the personal gifts. The widows that Jesus refers to when he tells the parable are the widows would sell their houses and everything that they own, and they would live like Anna did within the temple. The temple would then support the widows. but much of the time, what the widows gave to the temple was much greater than what they would ever themselves require. And it was also true that the children would also benefit from this tribute money that was coming in off of their parents' incomes to the temple. Besides these votive offerings and the sale of surpluses such as incense and flour, the people were wont on the Sabbath and feast days to bring voluntary contributions in their hands to the temple. Another and very large source of revenue was from the profit made by meat offerings, which were prepared by the Levites and sold every day to the offerers. But by far the largest sum was derived from the half shekel of the temple tribute, which was incumbent on every male Israelite of age, including proselytes, and even those slaves who had been freed. On the 15th day of Adar, the money changers would have open stalls throughout the country to change the various coins which the Jewish residents at home or settlers abroad might bring into the ancient money of Israel. And so we go on and learn more about this temple tribute and how corrupt the money within the temple, both with the widows and the priest and the Sadducees and the Pharisees would have been by the time that Jesus was coming in for this Passover, his first year of his ministry. If someone had not paid the temple or tribute, except for the priest, of course, they were exempt from this, their good would be fixed with an additional charge, sometimes up to double. So it's reasonable assumption that many of the foreign Jews, which would have been tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, would change money at these booths. If they missed the opportunity to do so in the villages, then they would do so as they were traveling in, then they would do so once they arrived. And as you know, when you travel, money exchanging can be very tricky. You can lose money in an exchange if the changer charges fees or additional collection money. And so I've traveled a lot in the world, and there's always a discussion about the best place to change money in every country. It can be different. It's a common conversation for travelers to be concerned about this. Hotels many times are not good places because they add these additional charges on, and they have lower exchange rates. This is not new, and our faithful travelers during this time among the dispersed children of Israel had to think about all the things that they had to do in order to prepare for this wonderful pilgrimage and trip that they were making. And so this is a reality, you know, when we think about this. The travelers would need money, shekels, to pay the tribute, but also to buy the necessary sacrifices and the necessities of the equipment or things that were not provided necessarily for them to then prepare their Passover feast and whatever needs might be needed in order to offer, and both to, like I said, prepare the feast. So they would have to get the groceries, so to speak, or the food items that were needed, the herbs, the oils, that kind of thing. And they would need money for purification. And while they may be able to use their own currencies along the way, outside the Jerusalem, and even sometimes in Jerusalem, that would not have been the case in the temple in all things pertaining to the Passover, which is why they had come. So that's where we are. And Jesus and his disciples would have been no different. And remember, on the very last night before Jesus is arrested, they are observing this Passover feast, and Peter and John are sent in early in order to go and buy the lamb, offer it, take it to the priest, have it observed, make the sacrifice, take the meat and cook it and prepare the Passover meal. I mean, this is arduous work. And so we can only imagine in our minds these tables, these Eastern money changers lined up in the courts among those selling animals for the sacrifice and the grain and the drink offering. So there was all kinds of things happening within this temple courtyard, this outer courtyard. There would have been scales for weighing and the coins, and deductions would have been taken for the loss of weight. There would have been arguing, disputing, bargaining. Can you imagine all that was going on as Jesus comes into this temple? Perhaps for the first time in years, I think we too would see the truth in all that he says and done. This was not the holy temple of the law that we have studied in Leviticus. This was now within the outer courts of the marketplace with ungodly disputes, cheating, materialistic hearts, who had come to prey on the faithful pilgrims seeking the forgiveness of their sins and the redemption under the law. And many had come, such as Moses and Mary and Joseph and Mary, in the years prior, to obey God, the Father of Israel, who through his promises had assured on this new year to forget the transgressions of his people. This was a big deal. So they were faithful. I mean, that's who Peter and John and the disciples were. And Jesus had come. He had always been in a household that had followed. These money changers would not be exhausted in this process, though. They would thrive on these days. And through their hands, probably all the business matters associated with the sanctuary would pass. Historians note such large amounts of silver brought to the temple treasury. Religion can always turn into such a huge money-making business when men are left to determine the processes. We see the same in the so-called Christian world. It does not take long for religion to become an institutional business. And of course, that is what is happening here. It had become a political and institutional process. The outer court of the temple is filled with a motley crew. All is hubbub and confusion. Merchants and worshipers in holiday attire present a riot of color. The lowing and the bleating of animals mingle with raucous cries of the drivers. The holy temple of God has been changed into a marketplace. The money changers were only a part of this activity. The noise, the business that would be present in the outer courts of the temple in these days before the Passover. A worshiper might bring a sacrifice, but it would have to be examined and it would have to be seen fit for sacrifice. Many would have choose to obtain a sacrifice and the drink offering when they arrived at the temple. The prices were fixed by tariff every month. And on payment of a stated amount, they would receive 4 receipts if they bought it within the temple, given for each payment in each part of the worshiper's sacrificial right. So if they were to bring an animal in from one of the stalls out in one of the villages along the way, they ran the risk of the animal being observed by the priest and not passing inspection. And then they would have to go back into the outer courts of the temple to buy an animal, which had been, in a sense, pre-approved in order that it might be successful and acceptable by the priest. So then they would take these 4 receipts and they would give them to the proper official, who would then proceed to give them an animal. Then they would go to the next station for the inspection. There would be a station where they would cut the throat. There would be stations along the way. They wouldn't, one priest, or remember, there were thousands and thousands of priests in the temple during these days who were doing the rites of sacrifice. Edersheim says the priest and the Levites in charge of this made up their accounts every evening. The transactions must have left a considerable margin of profit in the treasury. By the way, some was necessary. Some of this was necessary. We know from Deuteronomy 14 that the Jews were allowed to bring money to the temple on these occasions to provide the proper sacrifice and the tools that would be needed. So in proper sincerity, these concerns could be met. And that's why there were still many faithful among all these in the temple. But you have to remember, these faithful would have seen Jesus, heard Jesus's words, and understood clearly that Jesus was accurate about that. That this is not, that they saw a lot of cheating, a lot of disputes, a lot of things that were happening that should not have been so. So this would soon lead to another line of traffic. So they've got their, now they've taken these receipts, they've gotten their animal, if they've bought it within the temple grounds, that is. And then it would lead to this other line of travelers. Offerers might, of course, bring their sacrificial lambs with them or animals with them. And we know that on the Mount of Olives, there were 4 shops. And so outside of the city, there were some, especially for the sale of pigeons and other things that were requisites for sacrificial purposes. But then when it was brought, it had to be examined by this for Levitical fitness by persons regularly qualified and appointed. And so if they did get there's even stories about, the booths that were out on the Mount of Olives. If they bought them there, some of the priests would have been connected to those people buying them. And then they would have had special, when they were observed for the rite of the sacrifice, they would have passed the inspection more fully. There was a lot of cheating going on between the ones who were selling the animals for sacrifice and the ones who were inspecting the sacrifices. It is noted by Edersheim that now there could also be disputes. There would also be disputes in these lines due to the ignorance of the purchaser or the greed of the examiner. And so those in this line who had purchased their animals within the courts of the temple were able to avoid any dispute that faced the ones who might have purchased within the open markets outside, unless, of course, the priest was connected to that owner of the booth. And so the business of those within the court were quite profitable, since many worshipers would choose to avoid all the dispute, and they would come within the temple to pay. They even would have paid more money for their animal, because it would have, had they brought an animal in that was rejected, they would have ended up spending even more than that. So as we can imagine, temple business then had become quite corrupt, as happens to men when the possibility of earthly wealth can be disguised by religion. We see it all the time. There are people getting rich, preaching or on the name of Jesus, or setting up a charity that has a religious basis that serves men in one way or the other. What a disappointing and discouraging scene this must have been, though, for the faithful Jews. And Jesus happened to be one of those on this day. And so it is into these temple bazaars located within these outer courts that were brought in this text. And the disciples would remember this later, that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." Yet the zeal and devotion for God's house, which had led him thus to boldly challenge the hypocritical leaders of the nations and publicly denounce their corrupt management of the temple. And this, of course, had been prophesied. So we come here with Jesus to these outer courts. The property and the business of these bazaars was one of the principal sources of income for Annas and Caiaphas, the high priestly families. The bazaars, the stalls were there, so very near the location that the Sanhedrin actually met, the Hall of Hewn Stones. We've seen that on the temple chart. And this condemnation of Jesus on this day would be immediately challenged by these officials, who would be the ones so greatly affected by his actions, wouldn't they be? And so, if you look at this passage, the concern of these men at this point is the authority of Jesus to disturb their business, the marketplace, to disturb the marketplace. What authority do you come in here and interfere with our business? What sign do you show us since you do these things? What gives you the right to mess up our marketplace? The association for them was not spiritual. It does not seem, at least not here. They had not lost their ability. They had lost their ability to relate all that was happening to the authority of God. The booths had nothing to do in connection in these men's mind, really, with God. They were their business. The association was not spiritual. They were so much a part of the world that Jesus's actions on this day was about the booths and the money being changed. It was no indication here of any God problem. That doesn't seem to be something that has entered their mind. And actually, the fact that the crowds are not brought in some way to a form of riot or objection might lead us to understand that there were a lot of people in this temple that when they saw this happening, they knew that Jesus had the perfect right to do what he was doing. That the challenge, I don't know that they would know the prophecy, but the disciples seemed to begin to relate prophecies to Jesus. And there's no resistance by the thousands of people around. And really, even the priests don't seem to be alarmed that he might think what is happening might not be appropriate. I can't imagine that they didn't have others. And we want to note here, just as we have it in our minds, there are two different times when Jesus will react this way in the temple courts. Once is here at the very beginning of his ministry, as he's beginning this Judean ministry. And the first of the 3 years, he'll attend the Passover. And once again later, at the last Passover that he attends. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us about that day. It's not here, but 3 years later that Jesus will accuse these men of being thieves. He does not do that in this text. Again, what is interesting here is that we note by John that at the end is the disciples who were with him will remember his words about his own resurrection, that he would tear down the temple and raise it up in 3 days. They're beginning to make some connections, though vague at this point. I imagine this group and the others of the thousands that were there on that day watching and taking this in. I just imagine of them, his presence awed them. His words would have awakened their consciences that had perhaps grown discouraged and tired of waiting. The multitudes of faithful knew that indeed the temple had become a marketplace. The outer courts, which had never been intended to be a place of bargaining and money clinking around, had really become that place. On this occasion, I think he probably gained some respect, and he has certainly at least put on high alert those who had been waiting. I'm sure Simeon and Anna are gone at this point. They were waiting to die when Jesus had come in as a baby with Joseph and Mary. But I feel sure they would have considered this day well. Perhaps because the crowds are watching and waiting to see how this would be handled, the Jewish leaders do not arrest Jesus on this day. They did gather enough courage to come forward and approach him. They don't touch him. Strangely, they're not even going to correct him. I have often wondered if Nicodemus would have been among these that would watch in this. It's going to be just a few days before he comes and finds Jesus by night. And these men who come, they ask him for a sign before this multitude. Show yourself to be the one who has a right to do such things. This really is the temptation of Satan. Just, a couple of weeks before, when Satan says, make God prove this. Throw yourself off this pinnacle, this temple. This would always be a challenge, and Jesus would always know that the hearts of men would try to undermine. These rulers' sign could only come in his challenge to kill him, and he would be resurrected right there in 3 days. You tear down this temple, and it'll be raised in 3 days. I'll raise it in 3 days. You kill me, and I will show you victory. That will be your sign, is what he says. So Jesus meets their challenge of a sign with the challenge of a sign. Already, they must have begun to hate him, except for some, like Nicodemus, who will bury him, and Joseph. By the way, they had just seen a sign. And I think a lot of people in this crowd probably knew it. A single man with a whip. He made this whip out of cords, and he cleared the temple courtyard. They were awed at this. They knew they had seen something big. You think about what he did. Many of those people present must have known Jesus. We know his new disciples were there with him, and John says that they would remember this event later, like we've said, when Jesus was raised from the dead. There would have been many pilgrims from the Galilean area. Perhaps some of them had heard about some of the signs that were quietly beginning there near the Sea of Galilee and in Cana. And now this Jesus, Joseph's son, is turning over the tables that belonged to the money changers in the temple courts. I'm sure they followed and watched and listened as he went from table to table and from little fenced area where the animals were kept, setting them free, driving them out of the temple. Can you imagine what these new disciples, who already had just begun their faith that would anchor them for the next 3 years, would have thought? I can't even fathom what Jesus will do with our lives as we journey as his disciples. I tell you, young women, something. You learn from each event. in your lives, just as these disciples did. Jesus came to root up and overturn injustices, lies, disputes. And he does that for us. He arrives in our lives and he transforms us, and he roots up and overturns injustices and lies and disputes and the filth of our life as we cling to him. John and Andrew and James and Peter and Philip were just beginning to know the one who would identify and turn over all the defilement of their lives and the lives of others. Jesus said, you don't come to my Father with selfish desires. You don't worship him with the dust of the earth on you. You don't use him to justify your inability to dismiss this world. He accused them, in a sense, of going through the motions with a heart that was given over to the world. Malachi 3:1 tells of this event, says that this Messiah would be Israel's refiner and purifier. Scarcely had he entered the courts of the temple, just into the court of the Gentiles, and he begins to refine, to purify, just as Malachi had prophesied when he said, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is a refiner's fire, like a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purify the silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi, and he will purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer the Lord an offering in righteousness. Not one hand was lifted, nor one word spoken to arrest him, as he made a whip out of cords. And with it, he went into the temple court, whipping about, driving out the animals, pulling down the temporary fences, sheep and oxen running about. Not one word was said, no hand was raised, as he poured into the areas of the money changers, pulling out the tables, overturning the scales. This world has no answer for Jesus in his justice. The two accounts of the cleansing of the temple are quite different. We have no reason to believe that they weren't different events. John's the only writer who gives us this early account of the first Passover. And as you can imagine, there's a lot written about these two accounts and whether or not they're just mistimed and there was only one cleansing. But I do not agree with that. I think there are two, and I've stated why I believe that. There are several reasons why I believe that, and I've tried to talk about that. They are two different events. More importantly, it is one of the events that is most clearly demonstrates how very right Jesus was and how very important it was to be right. That he is truth. You know, we talk a lot about him being the light. He is also the truth, that there is no lie in him. There is no deception. He is totally right, absolutely right. And it is important to be right. And in the fact that Jesus was right, both now and 3 years later, makes clear that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were not right. They were wrong. And being right gave Jesus power. R.C. Foster says, right at the outset of his ministry, he assumed divine authority and declared his action. Behold, a greater than the temple is here. He towered above the Sadducees and the Pharisees and condemned their commercialized management of the temple on the ground that they had defiled my Father's house. A clearer assertion of his divinity would be hard to find. The Jews knew that Jesus was making the claim of being the Messiah by his action. This is the meaning of their challenge. Do some great miracle so that we may know. Why is it that many saw the supernatural of Jesus and others didn't? How is it that Nicodemus, one of these men, finds his way before Jesus leaves the city to him in the dark, wanting to talk more with him, being one of the ones that buries him 3 years later? So what were the results of this cleansing? The reformation of the practices of the temple were not permanent. I mean, 3 years later, for sure, we know they're back. You know, I think even on this day, it is a matter of him doing the very things that the Sadducees and Pharisees want him to do, and that is showing his authority. I'll tell you what he had done. He had done on this day what will define him for the next 3 years. He publicly puts on display the hearts of men. He allowed the common man or whoever would see it, the new idea of what God's house, his nation, this citizenship, this new discipleship would look like. A new ideal for God's house had been set in the mind of the nation. Foster said Jesus's action was like a charge of dynamite, which started to shake loose the strange hold which these false leaders had on the hearts of the multitude, and was the first step in trying to wrestle them free from such corrupt leadership. The Sadducees were in charge of the temple, but the Pharisees must have been in sympathy with their policy as to the market, for they raised no objection. And now the undying hatred of these malignant foes was raised. They were co-wed, but not convinced. They had been publicly rebuked, but they were not repentant. The scene gives us an insight into why Jesus spent so little time in the temple during his public ministry. He was in the temple more during his last week of the ministry than all the rest of the years combined. And his death follows after the week, and his death follows after the week he spends there 3 years later. He's never pictured going up to the temple to pray. He went to the desert or the sea or the mountains. He would find God in fervent prayer in the fresh and untarnished world of nature. And there he would empty himself. He would unburden his soul by asking his Father to relieve him while he remained in the flesh. And these ungodly hypocrites had gained possession of the temple, and they owned the religious rites and the ministry reserved for the Levitical priesthood under God's law. That's the discussion concerning the actions of Jesus here. We witness the beginning of the radical restoration. A revelation of the character of Jesus is seen here in this dramatic opening of his ministry. It's so strange to me that the others, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't talk about these days. Perhaps because John would have been the only witness at this point. We don't know. The others may not have been with him. We know Matthew hadn't been called yet. Mark was a young man. Luke's a Gentile. I don't think he would have been here in these early days, but John knew that Jesus, and perhaps, if John's a cousin, John may have known Jesus for years. And John knew that Jesus was not this gentle spirit always. And he's going to allow us to see Jesus in these very first days. That Jesus did not walk around unaffected by the actions of men. And he had reactions that his flesh allowed him to have. And John tells us that Jesus was a man with absolute and complete manliness, as shown in this moment, a fearful wrath. I don't know why. Perhaps it scares us to truly examine the temptation and the anger in Jesus. But as we talked about when we discussed the temptations, our Jesus endured personal injury and insult. Yes, death. But not that only. The outraged house of his heavenly Father. It was an outrageous house with disputes and arguments and outrageous behavior. And it caused Jesus to issue a thundering challenge that shook the whole nation to its foundations. And such is how it begins. The tender and powerful words of Jesus always pierce our hearts. This nation was about to be startled, to be changed, to be rescued, to be redeemed by the son of Joseph, a carpenter, and a boy from Nazareth.